Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Detroit Become Human, a 2018 title by Quantic Dream, helmed by the innovative but somewhat controversial and divisive figure of David Cage. Now, much like my earlier discussion on Life is Strange, Detroit Become Human is less your run-of-the-mill game experience of progressing and levelling, and instead relies on a sprawling, player-determinate story to maintain intrigue and engagement throughout. And indeed, Quantic Dream as a company has honed this concept on earlier titles such as Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, and has built an increasing appeal and competence in this arena towards the release of Detroit, which many already consider to be its magnum opus, potentially. And unlike the aforementioned Life is Strange and the now defunct Telltale game titles, player decisions have a much more radical impact on how the story of Detroit Become Human unfolds than, what these earlier contemporaries have really offered. So, diving right in, I think it's firstly interesting to consider David Cage's ethos within the medium of gaming, because it informs the mechanics of most of his titles and is a solid foundation to launch a discussion from. And Cage has stated in interviews that he's convinced that the medium of gaming has the capacity to elicit emotions and work as a thought-provoking artistic medium, beyond the formulaic platformer, a first-person shooter or RPG, and so on. And as a result, he infamously removes the classic win or lose binary that game mechanics, have generally had throughout history, these game over mechanics. And he allows an entire game story to play out regardless of the conventionally negative outcomes, including character deaths, in a largely player-determinate interactive setting. So this is interesting, but it's by no means a new concept or an innovative concept per se. And indeed, I recall discovering interactive storytelling as a child while I was reading certain editions of R.L. Stine's Goosebumps books, such as Escape the Carnival of Horrors, which had, multiple choice choose your adventure sort of endings and structures to them. In similar fashion, we have Dungeons and Dragons, which is very much a fluid adventure, depending on the parameters set by a dungeon master. And even looking back to pioneering video games of the early 1980s, such as the text adventure Zork, we've seen instances of player-determinate stories since the very advent of commercial gaming. But that said, Quantic Dream, and particularly the release of Detroit, takes these conventions and utilises them very effectively, I think, in trying to tell a more profound story and elicit more pressing emotional responses and exploring critical issues, I think, both in terms of the world and setting, but also the scenarios and the decisions that are presented to us as players. So, personally, I really enjoy this, as it takes a step towards allowing video games to meaningfully play to their strengths, which is interaction and judgment within an immersive fiction and framework, and presenting options around life and death, the lesser of two evils, and generally difficult moral choices within a narrative, along with the transparency of presenting your decisions and outcomes back to you at the end of an act, in comparison to what other players at the end of these acts have done. I think it really shows the potential of the medium and how, by gamifying moral conundrums, we can gain an interesting insight for defining individual versus collective priorities, interests and dispositions of players on a given subject, and also potentially, educating people and, leaning towards this sort of thought experiment we would find in philosophy and the self-development and critical thinking that students of philosophy, develop through studying this discipline. So, turning to Detroit Become Human specifically now, in this episode I'm going to consider how this concept is delivered through the interesting and immersive setting, characters and story of the title, that in many ways I think could prove a prototypical stepping stone to a full and meaningful realisation of video games as a medium. Kicking off with the setting, Detroit in many ways explores the well-trodden ground of a dystopian future, and basically every human concern over the past century, is condensed and has come to pass in this game. We are introduced to a world wherein the climate crisis has hit an irreversible crescendo, the gulf between rich and poor is at breaking point, tensions between East and West have escalated once more, And society has seen a paradigm shift wherein the advances of technology through the invention of androids has rendered a human workforce obsolete. As such, the world of Detroit straddles a somewhat familiar, relatable reality with the tropes of 20th century sci-fi, I think, and it's woven into this speculative moral story, which for all intents and purposes succeeds very well, I think. Indeed, just to touch on the story, there's something distinctly Blade Runner-esque about the central plot, with both the movie and this game revolving around a specialist cop who's hired to retire near human-like androids, known as replicants or deviants respectively, that have gone rogue and sought freedom beyond the confines of their pre-designated purpose. But where Deckard, in both novel and movie, follows a predefined narrative path owing to the nature of those mediums, Detroit and the benefits of immersive gaming permits us, the player, to control Connor's actions and intentions, allowing him to remain an automaton allied to his programming and human creators, or a liberated deviant allied to the cause of freedom and equality for androids. Similarly, we have Markus, who is the avatar of rebellion / liberation, depending on your perspective and how you choose to play the game. And this guy can either develop a pacifistic messiah sort of stance, or a hostile fascistic rebel sort of stance, depending on how you choose to play the game. And finally, we have Kara, who can develop autonomy and maternal human instincts with Alice, or remain a victim of domestic, societal and political violence, and in most other outcomes, if we don't take her down this best-in-class route, she usually ends up dying over the course of the game events. So, this premise is pretty solid in my opinion, and as players we have the freedom to indulge in choice and, steer the story to our own ends. And we also have a solid setting that doesn't stray too far beyond the real world or the sci-fi that we're familiar with. So we don't need too much exposition or hand-holding, to sort of explain everything that's going on. It comes to us pretty quickly. And the world is steadily built for us through NPC actions and reactions to our status as androids, and also the news articles that are dotted throughout the chapters, which are optional insights to the wider events that have contributed to the dystopian unrest that we find ourselves in. We also have an interesting cast of characters and micro-interactions that draw on other narrative tropes, such as Connor and Hank forming the buddy cop odd couple, with one being straight-laced, and by the book, as it were, and the other being a down-and-out maverick, which is familiar territory when we look at other media, such as Lethal Weapon, The Wire, Men in Black, Tango and Cash, to name but a few. So, this is all great, and this setting and these set pieces are excellent, but before I delve further into the game, it's probably worth touching on some of the criticisms that the game received as well. And on this note, I think it's interesting to consider how we might interpret the story and what you take from the experience personally and as a whole, because for my part, I really engaged with this game as an interactive thought experiment that utilised gameplay to pose moral questions to the player and explore the cause and effect of your choices in an intriguing and narrative fiction. I also enjoyed the setting and this sort of homage to sci-fi and the hard-boiled noir literature of the 50s and 60s, because these are genres and narratives that I really quite enjoy. And I always felt the game's main purpose was to sort of probe this choice and consequence idea, and also explore, the relationship between technology and society, which of course it hinges around quite heavily. But I bring this up because elsewhere, in certain reviews and articles I read around the game when it was first released, it's been argued that the game devolves into a certain by-the-numbers preachiness in places, and some actually consider it quite offensive in others, owing to the rather on-the-nose associations it makes with both the civil rights movement and the final solution. And some clear examples of that are, the segregation on public transport and in bars, the vernacular of Marcus's speeches, and the stripping and processing of androids for extermination camps. And personally, while I don't think the developers were going out of their way to be offensive, and probably used these familiar cues to try and convey the oppression of the androids in a very obvious way. I do see the argument for it feeling slightly reductive of real-world history, and it mishandles and perhaps slightly cheapens the severity of some actually quite horrific events of recent human history, when they could have portrayed things in a slightly less analogous way, I suppose. Beyond this, and regarding the criticism that this game gets a bit preachy, I think it again depends on how you choose to interpret the game and story, and also how you choose to play it. Because arguably, the game only becomes preachy if you allow it to. You know, if you're turning to a strategy guide and going by the book to try and, quote marks, win the game, as it were, by which I mean keep all your characters alive until the very end and try and get a positive outcome, then you could view the game as slightly idealistic, because the writers have determined that an amicable, pacifistic stance, particularly in response to violence and hostility, is what's required for the androids to survive in this world. And to that end, yes, we could argue that they've rigged the game to a sort of Kantian moral absolutism, which is observed in instances such as Markus not retaliating even when the police barricades are sort of shooting down androids left, right and centre. But if we play the game instinctively, and as a thought experiment, for example, you might believe that certain characters, such as Todd or the police and so on, do warrant being retaliated against or attacked and perhaps even killed. Or conversely, if you actually believe that androids are a threat and should refrain from becoming deviant, it makes the game a much more interesting experience, and the game proves a much more poignant experience in my opinion, because we can enact and observe the consequences without the fear that you're going to lose the best ending, which I think rigs this game. You know, as I said at the beginning, it's not like a platformer or an RPG where you sort of progress through level and try and complete it and win it. It's actually, the reason it branches is it's supposed to push you, the player, to make your own decisions and see what the outcome of that is. So the only thing I will say with regards to the story and this idea that it is too idealistic is that the writers have definitely weighted the desired outcome towards the liberation of the androids, helmed by this messiah figure of Markus. Because, of course, you know, we control the androids, so we have a vested interest in trying to keep them alive, to kind of continue playing the game. And, you know, although I'm getting kind of wayward and hypothetical with my opinion here, I think that for this game to succeed as an engaging exploration of ethics and morals, which I think it could succeed as, the inclusion of playable human characters would need to be introduced too. And in this way, the audience has the decisions, you know, to make based on, you know, the plight of the humans and also the androids. So you have this sort of weighted for and against. But as it stands, we're only seeing the androids' perspective. So thus, we are encouraged to care about them. And the humans, by comparison, are largely portrayed as ignorant and stupid, which I think is quite a cynical stance on things. But, you know, I'm digressing here and getting way too involved in this stuff that doesn't really matter. So, let's move on, and turning now to discuss this excellent cast of characters that we're introduced to and play through this story with, I'd like to kick off with Connor. Now, this guy is certainly one of the most popular characters in this game, and he's also got the most balanced and impressionable story, I think, in terms of whether you choose to side for or against, you know, the android movement. And indeed, he works in close proximity to Hank, his human counterpart, over the course of the game, while our other heroes, Markus and Kara, generally only encounter humans in hostile circumstances. So, you know, there is this clear for and against and balance in Connor's story. Equally, Connor is the last android to turn fully deviant in the canonical or desired events of the game. And so his neutrality and player interpretation of him is maintained through basically, you know, the majority of the story. And on that note, it was interesting how the writers handled his character, because the balance between Connor being a machine designed to fulfill a purpose, while at the same time being a hero character who's influenced by the player control. I think this was a delicate balance to make, and I think it was really handled very well by the writers and the developers. Connor was given just enough personality to seem unique and distinct early on, with the story explaining that he's this cutting-edge android designed to, specifically for hunting down and decommissioning deviants, much like Deckard in Blade Runner that I mentioned earlier. But he's also this amicable buddy cop who's designed to assist humans, such as Hank. And within this framework, the player input really allows us to pursue actions that, if deviant in nature, causes an instability in Connor's software. And an early instance of this is the ability to save a fish, right in the beginning of the game, in the prologue hostage sequence. And this, of course, displays empathy. But shortly after that, we also have the ability to find and conceal a gun, which conveys a sort of covetous behaviour, which is against his fundamental programming. So it's interesting to consider our encouragement of Connor to do things like this, because as humans playing the game, we are naturally inquisitive and resourceful and engaging in play, literally, where Connor naturally would not. So in a somewhat meta, weird sense, we, by our natures as human players, are, stoking these deviant elements that are at work within Connor. So, anyway, the prologue hostage sequence is the opening gambit and our introduction to the game events. And through the eyes of Connor, we glimpse the dichotomy between man and machine. And the first responders, the police in this sequence, are clearly unhappy about Connor's involvement in these events. And of course, the hostage taker itself, being a deviant android, makes things 10 times worse, and it stokes this hostility between man and machine, brilliantly laying the foundations of the central story that unfolds, shortly afterwards. Following the prologue, Connor is assigned to Hank, and although the latter character is not a playable one, he's a pivotal human counterpart to Connor and is integral to Connor's story as the most intimate exploration of the follies and the contradictions of the human condition, I think. But beyond this, and he is a flawed person, Hank also brilliantly displays its capacity for change and redemption, and the human's malleability and redemptive qualities. And as I alluded to earlier, the classic buddy cop dynamic is utilised between Connor and Hank to explore these ideas, and, let's face it, also provides some comical reprieve, which really balances out the story in the episodes featuring these guys. So, where Connor is the typical straight man, providing analytical, logical responses, even within the player's branching options, we don't depart from the essential programming and pragmatism of Connor's character. Hank is a much more volatile, abrasive character, established as a maverick cop who's gone off the rails and become a suicidal alcoholic, essentially. And just to briefly take a step back and look at Hank, Todd, Leo, and a couple of others, it's interesting to see how many of the human characters are actually reliant on drugs and chemical escapism in this game. And much like Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which Blade Runner was based on, there is a definite appetite for destruction among the human populace that is in stark contrast to the replicant androids, and their desire for freedom in both the game and the novel. And to quote Deckard in the novel, he states, "Most androids have more vitality and desire to live than my wife." And this is just a brilliant reference to her own brand of escapism, which epitomises, the human condition in these dystopian, sort of tragic worlds. So, Hank is a great character to observe through the lens of Connor, as his falling apart at the seams contrasts brilliantly with the amicable stoicism of the android, and his initial discrimination and ultimately quite redemptive story arc, if we allow it to be so. I think they are delivered really well through the framework of this buddy cop partnership. Now, moving on, Connor is also an interesting character because he's the only one of these 3 playable androids not to be victimised by humans or to necessarily rebel against his programming and combat them. And where Marcus is thrown in the trash heap early on and becomes this, resurrects himself as this sort of saviour figure, and where Kara is abused by Todd and goes on the run, Connor is again this balanced character, straddling the ideals of both the humans and the androids, and having the potential to go either way. And I think this is epitomised by the central conflict between his allegiance to either Hank or Amanda. And ironically, the more he allies to the human, Hank, the more he errs towards deviance, and the more he allies to the AI, Amanda, the more he sort of aligns to the conditions of his programming, and thus toes the line of subservience. So to my mind, Connor is a great character because he permits a little more interpretation than the other two protagonists, and is perhaps a little more sympathetic from that perspective, because while he's not victimised, he is certainly utilised as a tool in every sense of the word, and he seems strangely quite contented in that. From a purely subjective angle, I also really enjoyed Connor's story arc because his segments generally involve this sort of procedural detective work and the sleuthing that I really enjoy, in games and TV and novels, whether it's Broken Sword or The Wire or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, for example. So I found his game story and his, game mechanics particularly appealing, as I'm sure many others did. And of course, as I've already touched on, the relationship between Connor and Hank was a really enjoyable, emotive thing to try and nurture and proceed through the game with. So, moving on to Marcus, this guy also jockeys for position as the central character, owing to his story arc and eventual status as a sort of messiah of the android world. And there's a certain Christ-like allegory about him, with the inhabitants of Jericho forming this disciple-like entourage. And, even the terminology of Jericho itself, is this unsubtle reference to the Bible, possibly alluding to Jesus' passing through the city and healing the blind just before going to his death, which is, of course, a potential route for Marcus's story. And, of course, the fact that the city of Jericho was destroyed in the Bible, which, of course, happens to the Jericho in Detroit Become Human as well. So, Marcus has an interesting point of origin, particularly when we contrast him to a character like Kara, because, the latter is this domestic housemaid who's in a distinctly squalid blue-collar setting, and Marcus, by comparison, is equally, a domestic android, but he's living out a wildly different, comfortably bourgeois existence within the affable and paternal household of Carl the painter. And we're introduced to him kind of running errands for Carl in a short piece of world building. And, we do get a glimpse of, the story here because we see protesters on the street and unemployed people on the street denouncing androids. And potentially Marcus can get bullied here. And it's soon clear, however, that once he returns home, that his lot in life is a lot more comfortable, and it's a far cry from this drama of the city and the unrest that we've witnessed on the streets of Detroit, such as during the prologue when we're dealing with Connor's situation. Indeed, the relationship between Carl and Marcus, and Carl's obvious affection for the android, plays to the peculiar game title of Become Human, I think, because it prods at the idea of Marcus's ability to think and feel. And there's a certain significance in Carl being a famous painter because, this is my opinion, but I think art as an expressive medium is a uniquely human thing and something that generally requires imagination, conceptual thinking, self-awareness and emotion. So it's definitively human, and should therefore be the antithesis of what androids and their designated programming, as tools are capable of engaging in or appreciating. As such, the scene where Carl hands Marcus a paintbrush and asks him to paint something is quite a significant one, because he's almost willing, he's almost wishfully thinking for Marcus to inquire this sentience around which the central game drama hinges, and the question of the game hinges. And while Marcus doesn't acquire deviance, at least not at this particular moment, it's prudent that he retains Carl's teachings and affections later on. And in the quote marks canonical or, good story, we see Marcus take these learnings and, Carl's teachings and employing a more pacifistic stance on things, during the android uprising. Now, as I touched on earlier, several of the humans in this game indulge in a sort of depressive chemical escapism. And much like Todd in Kara's story, Marcus also has to contend with Leo, who is Carl's actual, biological son. And as a result of childhood abandonment issues, exacerbated by his father's apparent preference, to this android, Marcus, Leo has developed a drug addiction and a very volatile, unpredictable personality that leads to Marcus's demise and the second arc of his story. And indeed, there's a sort of very distinct cut-off between the first act and the second act of Marcus's story, where, he is thrown in the trash. And on several occasions, in the past, just digressing, I've mentioned this a lot in my Final Fantasy discussions, but I've touched on Joseph Campbell and the concept of the hero's journey and the monomyth. And I feel that Marcus loosely follows this set of, albeit quite generalised, conventions. But Carl proves this initial mentor figure, that the hero often, is introduced to quite early. And then Marcus being thrown into this trash pit shortly afterwards is this call to adventure, belly of the whale sequence, as it's known, from which he must fight his way back to prominence. And I think this quite horrifying segment of the game is really well delivered, and where some have described it, I've seen in a review they mentioned it like a scene out of Dante's Inferno, which is interesting. I'd go a bit further in that metaphor and suggest that it echoes this idea of the catabasis, which is a literary technique often found throughout history, wherein the hero has to traverse through hell for whatever reason. Whether it's Dante's Inferno, as we've mentioned, the Greek tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, or Don Andrea in the Spanish tragedy. And even, we have this anastasic resurrection of Christ in the Bible. So, this descent through hell and then almost the resurrection, from that seems to be the arc that Marcus takes, which I thought was really quite interesting, early in the story. The next arc of Marcus's journey sees him arrive at Jericho, and he quickly assumes leadership, and becomes this leadership figure, promoting the ideals of autonomy and freedom from human control. And at this stage, we really get to indulge the type of saviour that we want Marcus to become, and whether that's an overtly combative or a pacifistic sort of stance. We also have a multitude of decisions to make that inform which of the Jericho inhabitants like us, and chiefly we have the runaway pleasure house android North, who has the potential to become a love interest, as the game progresses. Now, at this juncture, Marcus becomes quite critiqued, and I think it's quite interesting about how we consider him from Jericho onwards, because in this second act he departs from the classical hero's journey, in my opinion, and where the heroes in Campbell's aforementioned theory often have to confront the shadow self, as it's known, whether it's Harry Potter facing down Voldemort or Luke Skywalker facing down Darth Vader, Marcus has no direct individualistic aims or, conflict with another nemesis, but rather his role becomes larger than life, as it were. It becomes more macro than himself. And as I said earlier, he becomes a messiah figure, urging an entire population into liberation and redemption, rather than this, solitary storyline that he has to kind of work his way through. And this is prudent to note because there's been debate around whether people prefer Marcus or Connor in the story, and there's always debate about whether Marcus or Connor are central characters in the story. And I think the confusion here comes in part because Marcus morphs from an individual to embody an idea rather than a personal plight, whereas Connor retains a personal plight throughout the story, which is both, his allegiance to Hank, or Cyberlife, as it were, and also his pursuit of Marcus, who very much becomes his nemesis, or at least, a direct obstacle for Connor to sort of pursue and contend with. But, personally, I think this sort of debate is slightly redundant anyway, because Detroit is very much an ensemble game. And the reason we control three characters is because there is no hero. but rather three characters embodying different perspectives of this essential human-android conundrum, which, we as players help to determine and shape. But anyway, returning to Markus, once he begins his charismatic rise within the ranks of Jericho, we witness a process of escalation and a raising of the stakes, wherein, canonically at least, we allow Markus to, rob the Cyberlife factory for parts, for example. We commandeer the TV station to put out our message, and ultimately we march through the streets of Detroit, in this existential protest. And each of these events sees Markus working in a team and leading a team rather than as an individual. And tellingly, even his prosthetic face is, his identity is removed, during the speech, which is both, of course, to conceal his identity, but also, once again, it's emblematic of the android cause, and, he becomes a symbol and a mouthpiece for a collective effort rather than an individual one. His macro role is further symbolised at this point in the game by his decisions, which increasingly influence public opinion, sending it up or down, rather than affecting the opinion of one or two individuals. And, we frequently find we have the opinion of Jericho as a whole, or we have the public opinion as a whole, rather than, one person reacting to us. So again, Markus's lot in life was to become this Christ-like allegory and saviour, which is only really anchored to reality, or an individualistic sense of self, by this potential relationship with North, which seeks to anchor him and offer some semblance of becoming human for him, I think. And of course, provide the player with some closure and an optimistic ending, if we so choose to go that way. So, turning finally to Kara, it's interesting that, unlike the other two, who are often debated as protagonists, she is comparatively less discussed as a central character, I think. And I've even seen some suggest that she's actually a pointless character. And to this end, I disagree, and I return to this idea that Detroit is very much an ensemble title. So, Kara is popularly regarded to embody the maternal instincts, and is emblematic of the android's ability to feel these sort of potent, raw emotions, I suppose. But she's also the main representation of the everyday androids and their plight, as it were. Their fear and their desperation, and their attempts at escape and freedom. And all of this is communicated through Kara's story, and I think hers has the much more uneasy and tense scenarios to contend with, particularly scenes where we encounter, the violently unpredictable Ralph, for example, or when we wind up being hunted in Zlatko's House of Horrors. So Kara is for the most part isolated and wary of both Connor and Markus, and of course the humans. And it's this core connection with Alice, and later potentially Luther, depending on how you play the game, that becomes her raison d'etre and very much pushes her on, towards the end. Now, Kara's early obstacles hinge around her owner Todd and the domestic nightmare that she has to endure with this violent, unemployed drug addict. And it's interesting, as an opening gambit that, as I've stated, contrasts heavily with Markus's lot in life, and it shows the darker side of the advent of the android, which is to say that, if you're not upper middle class or obscenely wealthy, then you're basically screwed. And as history often dictates, whether it's the invention of the steam engine or the invention of self-service checkouts into supermarkets, the manual workforce is generally the first casualty of commercial technology and technological innovation. And looping back round to Kara's situation, Todd is this former taxi driver who has found himself out of work because, self-driving cars have gained prominence. And interestingly, as I touched on right in the beginning, it's a setting and a scenario that's not a million miles away from where we are in our own reality. And, we have companies like Tesla who are trying to, bring this technology mainstream today. And And also, I think, looking at Todd this way and looking at his situation, it actually paints a slightly more understandable and empathetic picture of Todd's antipathy towards androids and, this slide into depression and addiction that he's gone through. Indeed, I've asked a few people in the past what they think about Todd, because while he's undoubtedly not a nice person by the time we encounter him in the game, I also empathise to some degree and at least understand why he is the way he is. Being too old and perhaps too undereducated to upskill or reskill in an environment, already rife with mass unemployment and competitive job markets. His wife and kids are gone. It's understandably quite a despairing life and a despairing situation for him. And barring one set of circumstances that can actually lead you to encounter Todd later in the game, and we see him as a ultimately quite apologetic person to Kara. Besides this one avenue of the story, he actually has, quite a unfulfilled and morbid existence, really. And for my part, the few times that I've played through the story of this game, I accidentally kill him quite often, mainly because I'm terrible at those quick-time events. So, moving on to Kara, the best outcome story usually sees her rescuing Alice and going on the run, and it is through this partnership that the maternal bond is fostered, and much like Hank and Connor relying on this buddy cop trope to propel their story forwards, I think Kara and Alice also have a very cinematic relationship that reminds me of other post-apocalyptic and sci-fi movies, wherein we have a single paternal figure who's guiding this child through imminent danger towards a potential haven. For example, we have Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road, which is an obvious example, and it's a book and a movie that I really loved. Absolutely terrifying, but really good example of this father-son, paternal-child dynamic. But we also have stuff like Tom Cruise, War of the Worlds, that movie, 28 Days Later, Bird Box, and the early stages of the Walking Dead series. And even looking at video games, of course, we have The Last of Us, which sees this young generation being guided, by an older person towards safety. So I think this is a trope that we see repeated in movie and popular media, and it's something that Kara and Alice's dynamic rests on as well, and employs quite strongly. So, as I've stated, much of Kara's story is around desperation, and we see her putting trust in strangers, and this range of outcomes that can branch from this. And generally, Kara gets perpetually screwed until, quite distastefully, we find ourselves having to screw over a human family. If we want the good ending, we actually have to screw over some people for the bus tickets at the end of the game, which seems quite contrary to what Kara's moral guidance of Alice has been building towards throughout the game. So I found that odd. And we also have Alice's eventual reveal in the end game as an android, which is quietly alluded to at intervals throughout the game. And again, is another talking point, I think, because I personally felt that Kara and Alice, as an android and a human, epitomised this coexistence between the two entities that Markus and all the macro-political stuff was sort of striving towards and raising questions about. And I feel that revealing Alice as an android seemed to be a reveal for the sake of being a reveal, and I don't think it contributed much to the greater thematic and narrative trajectory of the story. But again, that's a personal opinion, and I'm open to discussion on that, because it wasn't really a detriment or a bonus to the story particularly. It is the way I see it. Now, if we play our cards right by the standards of the game, and gear towards this optimistic ending, Kara, Connor and Markus wind up united in the church sequence, which in and of itself is quite a rewarding reprieve from the drama and the violence that we've kind of struggled through, so far. And it's also the penultimate scene before we all branch off again to our respective dramatic conclusions. So we have Connor confronting his clone self and attempting to save Hank. We have Kara and Alice crossing into Canada. And we have Marcus leading this peaceful march through the city. So that's a really broad look at the characters within the framework of the game. And there's some other interesting things that I haven't quite touched on, which augment the story and this idea of technological sentience. And the most glaring for me is the concept of RA9 and this cult-like religious sect that has crept into existence among the deviants. And I found this interesting because it's an objective take on how the search for meaning can emerge from potentially irrational or incidental triggers. RA9 is this mythic deviant from which a primordial belief system has sprung up among the androids, and it mimics the form and function of our own, human pagan belief systems, involving rudimentary shrines and carvings and that sort of thing. And as humans looking at androids, this seems nonsensical and bizarre. But then at the same time, it sort of begs the question of whether it's holding a mirror up to our own belief systems and how they could have sprung into being. And I also think the concept of RA9 leans towards the idea of androids becoming human. And to fall back on the tried and tested Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am." This level of self-awareness and self-exploration for truth and meaning indicates that the androids are more than mere imitations of life, but indeed have fostered a life of their own through this inquisitiveness and self-awareness. On the note of self-awareness, another subtlety to the game is hostess Chloe, who appears on the title screen. And this was a great piece of immersion because she periodically remarks on our progress and discusses the plight of our characters, almost like a personal companion. But as we inch into the later stages of the game, we also witness her increasing confusion and obvious erring towards deviance. And where we're periodically given the option to engage and answer questionnaires with Chloe, the ultimate choice is whether to free her once her deviance becomes clear, which I always found pretty interesting. Another more general note of the game, and discussions that are bound up with this, is about whether this is really a doomed reality that we're hurtling towards, and how accurately placed, Detroit Become Human could be. And for my part, I think that while the game trends closely to real-world issues, such as East and West tensions and environmental crises and so on, I think the practicality of mass-marketed androids seems like a pretty big stretch, because history shows us that while technology does indeed usurp and replace traditional labour and job roles, this virtually never takes the shape of a discernibly humanoid object, which in many cases would be an impractical shape to take anyway. So, obviously I mentioned the Steam engine and self-service checkouts earlier, which are obvious examples. And I think the necessity of making a machine look like a human only really comes into play when you're trying to craft some sort of emotive connection or closeness, with a human user, to interface with. Because, that's what we respond to as humans. So, personally, I think humanoid-looking androids, the likes of which we see in Detroit, would realistically prevail in companionship capacities, such as in old people's homes, and of course, a little despairingly, the sex industry, more than anything else. But that's just my 2 cents worth, and a completely hypothetical digression. So, before I wrap up, I wanted to take a moment to discuss the gameplay mechanics and the controls of this game, which extends across most Quantic Dream titles, such as Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, because their approach, particularly during the QTE, action segments, really relies on player engagement and a deftness of hand to sort of successfully complete things. And for my part, I'm still really undecided on whether I think this is a innovative immersion tactic that keeps me engaged and on point with the story and the action, or whether it's simply really annoying ergonomics that encourage me to do awkward analog movements, just to open a door or pick something up. So again, I'm not saying anything decisively for or against it, but It's simply something that I've noticed that is very particular to the Quantic Dream titles. And sometimes, the actions I have to make seem superfluous to the scenario that I'm in, as I said, such as opening a door. But having said that, when you do successfully succeed in one of these fast-paced QTE combat sections, for example, it actually feels quite rewarding as well. So, yeah, generally I'm kind of on the fence with the gameplay mechanics. So, there we have it. A somewhat abbreviated take on the game, which I think can probably be approached and discussed, and indeed politicised in any number of ways. Broadly speaking, Detroit Become Human is a very good game, driven forwards by an excellent cast of characters, from our android protagonists through to the ancillary human counterparts, such as Hank, Rose, Todd, and Carl. Some have argued that besides Rose and Carl, humans are unfairly portrayed as bigoted idiots in this game. But I think that's to misunderstand the essential problem that androids are presenting in this world, and to consider androids blindly as good simply because we control them, doesn't really separate them from the essential problems that they create for humans in this game, particularly economically and existentially. And returning to my very early point, it would have been great, I think, to get some more human input and some human playable input in this game to offer a more balanced story, to this end. So, if you got this far, kudos to you, and thanks very much for listening. Feel free to drop a comment with your thoughts on the game, and if you enjoyed the episode, please consider liking and also subscribing to keep updated with my latest posts.